Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, it's my privilege and honor to introduce an Italian Academy lecture by Carlo Ginzburg. And when I say that privilege and honor, I really mean that. This is not just a pro forma beginning, the usual slightly banal effort at a captatio benevolentiae, the engaging of the audience's goodwill. For Carlo Ginzburg surely is one of our greatest historians, perhaps the greatest. He writes with power and clarity. He touches on urgent issues. Above all, he sets the standard for anyone not only who writes history, but seeks to figure out what kinds of history work and what don't and why. I can't think of anyone now living who has his extraordinary range and depth or has contributed more to the epistemological core of what makes the humanities so important. As someone who has always felt the necessity of bridging the epistemological gap between the humanities and the sciences, Carlo's work not just on what makes the humanities distinctive, but why we need to preserve the integrity of that distinctiveness could not be more crucial in our time. If you read Carlo, if you read any one of his books, you know immediately why the humanities matter. In one powerful work after another, he has made clear why the study of the humanities is essential, not only for our moral well-being, to put it rather grandly, but also as a set of disciplines with an epistemological value that is at least as critical to our future as what we now call science. I should say, you know, there's a big difference between what we call science in English and the German Wissenschaft. And for once, one can be happy that the English dimensions of the word science are not either as extensive or as conflated as the German Wissenschaft. These are separate, even though, as I say, I have always tried to make them work together. But of the rigor of Carlo's work, there could be no doubt, as his continuing preoccupation with the need to discover and discuss counterexamples of the very examples he cites so clearly demonstrates. But that discussion we can perhaps leave for next week. So last year, at more or less this time, in conjunction with the University of Pennsylvania, Carlo gave us 3 extraordinary lectures, the first on Dante, the second on Montaigne, and the third on Michelangelo and Machiavelli. I was going to give a summary of those lectures, but I know you want to hear Carlo, so I suspend that for the moment, because of course it was much more than just those 3 figures. These were not prosopographical lectures. So as in most of his work, however, what was common to all of them was how Ginzburg teases out both well-known and much less well-known texts into dealing with some of the major methodological issues facing historians, above all about the ways in which we deal with matters of proof and truth, and of the importance of never neglecting the anecdote, the details, and the inconsistencies of texts, the importance of both the literal and the allegorical meanings of things, and how the individual relates to the universal. Now, in today's lecture, Carlo Ginzburg returns to the theme of what I think he will admit to be the most contested and controversial of all his books, The Enigma of Piero. So many people got on their high horses about the purely iconographic and chronological distinctions of his analysis of the baptism of Christ in London, the Arezzo fresco cycle, and above all, the flagellation in Urbino, that they simply missed the larger issues which he actually raised quite openly and tactfully in the original and subsequent prefaces of his book. Although he noted that stylistic analysis and the traditional methods of connoisseurship cannot provide definitive evidence for the absolute chronology of the works in the absence of the kinds of documentary and contextual evidence like commissioning and patronage, the art historians really hated Carlo's dating of the pictures, his identifications of the protagonists, his outline of the iconography, not all, but many, and his account of the contexts which he thought relevant, but they did not. The response was explosive, but it was also impatient. In contrast to Carlo's patient and courteous and tactful responses to his critics, who failed to reflect on his extraordinarily sensitive discussion of Longhi, still neglected in the Anglo-Saxon world, and his characteristically careful distinction between natural and necessary proof, the Aristotelian tekmerion, and the semea, the clues and indications that form a critical paradigm for all historical investigation, on which Carlo Ginzburg has reflected more than any other historian living. I could cite the works, but that would take far too long. But his work in general, as he reminded his readers already or his work in this case, as he reminded his readers already in the preface to the translation of the 1994 edition of the Enigma of Piero, has always been about the theme of proof. This is the knotty theme about which Carlo has never stopped to reflect on and to struggle over with inspiring persistence. Even, I want to just add this, even up till the marvelous new collection of essays just out in Italy, about which I will have more to say next week, entitled La lettera uccide, the letter kills. I hope, Carlo, that you will forgive me if I anticipate a bit of what I intend to say next week in what I hope will be a shorter introduction than this one, when I tell you that Carlo's moving preface to that most moving of all his collections of essays, La lettera uccide, he concludes the introduction with the phrase, La lettera uccide che lo ignora. The letter kills he who ignores it. Because in it, as we shall see, in this book lies the clue, and in the letter lies the clue to the real and distinctive contribution of the humanities. But in the meantime, let me give space to Carlo to speak not just about Piero, I think, but about connoisseurship, Morelli, and Berenson, another theme that has joined the two of us and many others over the course of so many years of discussion and incredibly fruitful debate. Thank you all. Welcome again, Carlo. The floor is yours.
In 1861, right after the political unification of Italy, Giovanni Morelli and Giovanni Battista Cavalcaselle, a connoisseur and an art historian, both bound to become famous and famously enemies, made a journey across Umbria and Marche in order to prepare a catalogue of artworks owned by the ecclesiastical institutions. Morelli's Taccuini handwritten notebooks related to that journey were published a few years ago. It is a document which includes some unexpected passages, such as the comment on Piero della Francesca's flagellation, next, which Morelli had seen in the sacristy of the Urbino Cathedral. A detailed description of the panel's material conditions was introduced by a few dense remarks. Once again, Piero's dealing with perspective is sublime, but he lacks good taste, as always, minute as a German, and sometimes even clumsy, senza gusto, come sempre, minuto come un tedesco, e alle volte anche goffo. Morelli's taste was unable to accept the taste of a painter who will be discovered a few decades later in a completely different context. The Flemish component of the flagellation, minuto come un tedesco, which Morelli judged incompatible with Piero's sublime perspective, was displayed in the sublime luminous scene in the background, next, as well as in the rich costume of the man on the right, next. In his famous monograph on Piero della Francesca, published in 1927, Roberto Longhi, unaware of Morelli's still unpublished remark, which he would have scornfully rejected, wrote, quote, next. The garments in the blue and gold brocade worn by the old minister are unmatched in the European painting of the period, with the sole exception of the clothing of the Chancellor Rollin, painted about 20 years earlier by Jan van Eyck. It is all the more admirable that Piero could bring the Northern master's sublime optical intimacy into such harmony with Italian measurement. And we must think that we are seeing here the first hints of developments that will manifest themselves more fully about a decade later. Next. We must suppose, e si deve supporre, that we are seeing the first hints here. But why deve? We must. To answer this question, we'll have to focus on the iconography of Piero's flagellation, a topic hotly debated until today. According to a local tradition, the young, barefoot young man would be Odantonio da Montefeltro, first Duke of Urbino, surrounded by two councillors, Manfredo dei Pio and Tommaso dell'Agnello. Their evil behavior engendered a conspiracy that led to the murder of Odantonio in 1444. In Longhi's book on Piero, the illustration of the flagellation is commented upon in the following terms. Next. The year 1444, when these tragic events took place, may thus serve as an approximate date for the painting, since Odantonio's successor, Count Federico, presumably did not wait too long before having an image made to commemorate his brother's death. Moreover, the style likewise points to a period earlier than that of the frescoes at Arezzo. The architectural setting has its marvelously classical passages, but is nonetheless more slender than that produced by the divine measurement manifest in the Arezzo frescoes. Even the sense of almost exaggerated mathematical demonstration that underlies the picture as a whole, exaggerated, that is, even by comparison with the general trend of 15th century Italian painting, is typical of the beginnings of Piero's artistic development. End of quote. To regard the flagellation's mathematical demonstration as an exaggeration, typical of the beginnings of Piero's artistic development, sounds rather shocking. In this case, the evaluation of stylistic data, shaped by the acritical acceptance of an iconography rooted in a local tradition, misled a great connoisseur like Longhi, paving the way to a distorted vision of Piero's pictorial trajectory. We are faced with an intricate connection between chronology, connoisseurship, and iconographic analysis, a topic which is at the heart of my book, Indagini su Piero, first published in 1981. A large part of it was devoted to demonstrating that the early date of the flagellation, advanced by Longhi, was unacceptable. Since I'm not an art historian, the idea of contradicting one of the greatest 20th century art historians on the date of a famous painting sounded paradoxical, to say the least. My book was widely discussed and often harshly criticized. It has been translated into 8 languages. In a recent monograph on Piero della Francesca, the art historian Alessandro Angelini mentioned the great impact of my book, which he defined next: a good whipping, una frustata, undoubtedly a frontier text, which came out at a moment of perhaps the most acute crisis perceived by traditional art history as a discipline. Its impact, whatever it may have been, was related to the questions I started from, not to the answers I put forth. This is why, 40 years on, I've decided to focus once again on the questions I dealt with and their implications. In his autobiography, issued in 1977, Kenneth Clark commented on his own monograph about Piero della Francesca, first published in 1951 and then reissued in revised form in 1969, in the following terms. Next. I will not deny that there is a good deal in Piero that is inexplicable, notably the Urbino flagellation, which will keep art historians busy far into the foreseeable future. More than 40 years later, this sentence looks like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Apparently, no European painting has been the subject of a wide scholarly debate comparable to the flagellation, the panel which Piero signed in capital letters. Next. No, sorry, the next one. Yeah. Opus Petri de Burgo Sancti Sepulchri. Two elements contributed to this: its extraordinary quality and its inexplicable subject. Possibly inspired by Clark's remark on the latter point, the English publisher of my book, Indagini su Piero, which, as I said, is mostly devoted to a close analysis of the flagellation, translated it as The Enigma of Piero, a catchy title, literally echoed by an Italian scholar, Silvia Ronchey. In 1839, in the earliest detailed description of the flagellation, Johann David Passavant, painter and art historian, mentioned three Latin words inscribed on the painting, or perhaps on its frame: convenerunt in unum. These words, which later disappeared, possibly following a restoration, are taken from the second psalm. Next. Why did the Gentiles rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers were gathering together against the Lord and against his anointed. Convenerunt in unum adversus Dominum et adversum Christum, et adversus Christum eius. These words are quoted in Acts 25:27 and commented as follows. Quote, for truly in this city there were gathered, convenerunt, together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. End of quote. The reference to Pilate strongly supports the authenticity of the words convenerunt in unum, inscribed either on the painting itself or on its frame. But what is the relationship between the flagellation of Christ represented in the background and the three individuals in the forefront? I've already mentioned the answer to this question provided by the local tradition. In 1962, Roberto Longhi, who had endorsed it, suggested a cautious revision of the flagellation's early chronology, advanced in the first edition of his monograph on Piero. Next. Regarding the approximate date of this picture, the flagellation, which some scholars think later than I proposed, I too am now inclined to put it a few years later, but still in a phase preceding the Arezzo frescoes. End of quote. Some scholars, in fact, one of them, Kenneth Clark, in the first edition of his Piero della Francesca, published in 1951, Clark referred in a footnote to Longhi's standard monograph in the following terms. Next. It is, if possible, too brilliant, and the total impression it leaves upon the mind is strangely unconvincing. But it is full of learning, insight, and ingenuity, and it is not likely to be superseded. Next. Clark's book was, Longhi answered, 1962, quote, for the cultivated public, an excellent replacement for my own old and almost impossible to find book, a book which had, in any event, never been meant to popularize its subject matter. Clark himself, while unstinting in his praise of my monograph, finds it strangely unconvincing, a judgment that I myself can agree with, for the same reason for which I find Clark's text highly readable and accessible to a wide public. Longhi was a haughty scholar. To regard Clark's book on Piero as a replacement of his own, which Clark himself had called strangely unconvincing, but not likely to be superseded, was a gesture Longhi was not accustomed to. True, the gesture was immediately qualified, as though that replacement were based on the wide audience addressed by Clark's very readable and well-written text, very different from Longhi's difficult style. But the heavy word replacement must have implied also self-criticism based on the content of Clark's book. If I'm not mistaken, the point of major divergence between Clark's and Longhi's approaches was related to the flagellation. Clark rejected the traditional identification of the young man in the forefront with Odd Antonio as absurd in terms of content and untenable from a formal point of view. Next. The Arcadian figure in the centre, with simple tunic and bare feet, is clearly not a dissolute tyrant, meaning Odd Antonio, not are the two grave personages who stand beside him at all like evil counselors, Manfredo del Pio and Tommaso dell'Agnello. There is no reason why Piero should have been asked to commemorate an event which was regarded as a much-needed deliverance, still less to symbolize it by the sufferings of Christ. On stylistic evidence, the flagellation must have been painted after 1451, but the resemblance of the bucolic figure to the angels in the baptism and a certain lightness in the handling suggest a date before 1460. The architecture is almost exactly the same as that of Solomon's palace in the Arezzo fresco. The head of Pilate remarkably similar to that of Constantine. So we may tentatively place the flagellation between 1455 and 1460, the years of Piero's greatest activity. Now, next, we have the next, please. You may see on the left the angels in the baptism, which is now in London at the National Gallery. And then next, the Solomon's Palace, next, from Arezzo frescoes. And then, next is the head of Constantine his headdress is similar to Pilate's headdress in the flagellation. To sum up, the dismissal of the traditional iconography paved the way to a chronology based on stylistic evidence, partially dated, partially conjectural. In commenting on the painting's illustration, Clark narrowed down its tentative date to between 1455 and 1460. The flagellation, he wrote, must have been painted after Piero's acquaintance with Alberti at Rimini in 1451, but before his journey to Rome in 1460, in fact, 1459. The resemblance with Solomon's palace gives a date, 1456-57. Now here, next. Okay. Okay, this is the reference to Alberti at Rimini. Next one, please. This is Piero's fresco representing Sigismondo Malatesta kneeling in front of San Sigismondo. So you may see the column and so echoing Alberti's architecture. At this point, Kenneth Clark, developing a remark made by Felix Witting, advanced some new hypotheses about the iconography of Piero's panel. Next. The flagellation of Christ symbolizes the tribulations of the church. And in these years, the Christian church did in fact suffer one of its greatest setbacks, the taking of Constantinople by the infidel in 1453. As the bearded man, next please. Sorry, next one. Okay. As the bearded man is clearly a learned Greek, inspired by the memory of Paleologus, it seems reasonable to suppose that the picture is connected with that event, meaning the fall of Constantinople, and commemorates one of the councils held to consider how it should be met, perhaps the Council of Mantua in 1459. End of quote. Two hypotheses put forward by the same scholar. The first, 1456-57, based on stylistic elements. The second, 1459, based on iconography. Is the gap between those dates so relevant? Il faut dater finement, somebody might say, quoting Jules Michelet. In allusion to the Council of Mantua, aimed to set up a crusade against the Turks, which did not take place, could imply that Piero painted the flagellation while he was working in Rome, meaning not before the Arezzo cycle, along his hypothesis, but in the middle of it. What is at stake here is not only the date of the flagellation, but the chronology of the Arezzo frescoes. In other words, the crucial stage of Piero della Francesca's pictorial trajectory. Venturing along the path opened by Kenneth Clark, I tried to develop his interpretation of the flagellation iconography and its chronological implications. Here I will present only one element of it, starting from a remark made by Marilyn Aronberg Levin, who saw an allusion to the Scala Santa in the staircase depicted behind Pilate. Next one, please. I discovered in the flagellation another element related to the ancient Lateran palace, and therefore to Piero's documented stay in Rome, a column traditionally identified as a relic which preserved Christ's height, mensura Christi. As soon as I measured the column, I realized that the height of the part that was not buried in the ground, next one please, had exactly a 1:10 ratio, 187 centimeters vis-a-vis 18.7 centimeters to the height of Christ in the flagellation. Next one, please. Whose role in the panel's measures had been independently emphasized by another scholar. In my view, this hidden allusion to the lateral mensura Christi could not be ascribed to chance. Therefore, it implied a terminus ante quem non. The flagellation was executed either during Nero's stay in Rome in 1458-59 or after it. The autography of Piero's flagellation has never been cast in doubt. What I've said so far focused on a different issue, meaning the relationship between iconography and chronology. Hence, my predictable conclusions. Chronology based exclusively on stylistic evidence can be only relative. An absolute chronology based on calendar must be connected to some external evidence, which may provide an approximate date, ante quem, post quem, ante quem non, and so forth. If I'm not mistaken, Piero's flagellation as a case study points at a tension between static and dynamic morphology that can throw some light on a crucial chapter in the history of connoisseurship. I will start from Bernard Berenson's juvenile, unfinished piece written before 1894, Rudiments of Connoisseurship. This was, as Berenson explained in an introduction dated 1902, a fragment from a never published book, quote, on the methods of constructive art criticism, end of quote. As is well known, Berenson considered himself a disciple of Morelli, who introduced a new practice of connoisseurship, but was, quote, unfortunately a mere empiric, hostile to philosophy. The elements that may lead to the attribution of a picture listed in Rudiments of Connoisseurship clearly echoed Morelli, starting from the most applicable, the ears, the hands, the folds, the landscape. But, Berenson argued, next. The forms employed as tests, being themselves the results of habits of visualization and execution, the forms must inevitably change as the habits change. In the case of a long-lived artist, the forms in the works of his old age will scarcely bear a resemblance to those in the early pictures. A hand, an ear, a fold, a landscape background that would be perfect tests of an early Titian would, for example, furnish no tests whatever for a late Titian. End of quote. The targets of Berenson's remark were, quote, those students of today who apply tests regardless of time limits, unquote. Unnamed followers of Morelli, or more probably Morelli himself. In any case, a sentence written in italics like, quote, next. Oh, no, sorry, let's go back to the previous one. A sentence written in italics like, the value of those tests which come nearest to being mechanical is inversely as the greatness of the artist. This sentence has been considered clear evidence that Berenson rejected a fundamental point of Morelli's method. But this conclusion is, as I will argue, unacceptable. The next step in my backward trajectory will lead predictably to Morelli. His method, as Morelli himself labeled it, was first presented in the essay on Italian paintings in the Borghese and Doria Pamphili galleries, published under the pseudonym of Ivan Lermoliev in the Zeitschrift für Bildende Kunst between 1874 and 1876, and then in a different version in a book of the same title published in 1890. As far as I know, nobody paid attention to the small but not irrelevant divergences between the two presentations. Morelli began his argument by quoting a passage by Charles Blanc, the founder of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, 1861, target that was bound to re-emerge over and over again. Pour juger de l'authenticité d'un tableau, il importe de connaître l'esprit du peintre plus encore que ses procédés, car les procédés s'apprennent, le faire se transmet et s'imite, mais l'âme ne saurait se transmettre. Elle est essentiellement inimitable. Morelli pointed out that his approach to connoisseurship was quite the opposite. Next. I've never neglected the study of the procédé, the fare of the master. What, for instance, is the form in a picture through which the spirit of the master, l'âme, la tournure de l'esprit, Charles Blanc once again finds expression? Surely not the pose and movement of the human frame alone, the expression, type of countenance, coloring, and the treatment of the drapery. These are undoubtedly important parts of form, but do not constitute the whole form. It includes, for instance, the hand, one of the most expressive and characteristic parts of the human body, the ear, the landscape background, if there be any, and the chords, also called harmony of color. In the work of a true artist, all these several parts of the painting are characteristic and distinctive, and therefore of importance, for only by a thorough acquaintance with them is it possible to penetrate to l'âme, la tournure de l'esprit, to the very soul of the master. End of quote. The passage on the hand and the ear, the core of Morelli's method, is introduced in a most unassuming way. For instance, equally unassuming is the next transition. Next. Nor is the soul, das ist aber noch nicht alles. As most men, both speakers and writers, make use of habitual modes of expression, favorite words and sayings, which they often employ involuntarily and sometimes even most inappropriately, so almost every painter has his own peculiarities, which escape him without his being aware of it. End of quote. The word involuntarily, absichtlos, absent in the first version, emphasizes the connection between this passage and the previous one. Marginal details of a painting, like hands, ears, and so on, are peculiarities which almost every painter is unaware of. An example follows, which pushes this point to an extreme. Next. No, sorry. Okay, just a moment. An example follows, which pushes this point to an extreme. Quote, it does even happen, ja, es geschieht selbst, that an artist reproduces certain of his own physical defects in his works. End of quote. A passage by Leonardo, this Morelli again, quoted in the footnote, says, quote, a painter who has clumsy hands will use similar hands in his paintings, and so forth. These passages are well known, but it was useful to look at them again, since they may throw some light on a less known episode. In October 1891, Wilhelm Bode, director of the Berlin Art Museum, published in the Fortnightly Review an essay which included a long passage on Giovanni Morelli, who had died a few months before. In this sarcastic obituary, a bitter coda to the aggressive remarks that the two men had exchanged for many years, Bode wrote, quote, as a surgeon, in fact, Morelli was neither a surgeon nor a doctor, although he had studied comparative anatomy, quote, he had his attention directed to the form of the human body, and especially of its extremities. And when thus engaged, he thought he discovered that every great artist, even in painting portraits, made use of his own extremities as models for the subject in hand. Later, he issued a catalogue of the ears, noses, and fingers, the former property of Sandro, Mantegna, Raphael, Titian, and company, and with his schedule in hand, every lover of art is to patrol the picture galleries, when he will be able to single out unerringly the different masters, in spite of all the wretched mistakes of the directors. And of course, the source of this parody, Leonardo's quote, is not mentioned. Morelli diagrams of ears and hands drawn by different painters. Next. Were presented as a depiction of each painter's former property, meaning of their own ears and hands. Bode's caricature elicited an angry reaction from Henry Layard, who, in his introduction to the translation of Morelli's book on the Borghese and Doria Pamphili galleries, wrote. Next. Sorry. Okay, let's go back to the previous one, please. So this is Layard's comment. Quote, I am surprised that a man of Dr. Bode's intelligence and, it may be presumed, sense of truth, should have committed himself to such a statement. End of quote. In commenting on Bode's attack, Jamie Anderson, well-known authority on Morelli, ignored the blatant distortion of the latter's method, limiting herself to correcting some biographical details. In fact, the quote from Leonardo, which Bode tacitly used to introduce his caricature of Morelli's method, was, according to Jamie Anderson, the indirect source of, quote, a caricatural interpretation of Morelli's method, which obscures its most important core, although it appeals to contemporary taste. End of quote. The culprits of this caricatural interpretation, Sigmund Freud, followed by Edgar Wendt, and the present writer, myself, focused on a marginal element of Morelli's approach: the importance of involuntary traits related to marginal details, invariably missed by copists, but crucial for the connoisseur. Undoubtedly, this element played a central role in the contemporary reception of Morelli's method, but it played a central role also for Morelli himself, who, after his reference to Leonardo's quote, continued as follows. Next. Anyone, therefore, intending to study a painter more closely and to become better acquainted with him, must take into consideration even those material trifles, Kleinigkeiten. A student of calligraphy will call them flourishes, Schnörkel, and know how to discover them. For this purpose, of course, an examination of one and even of several of the master's paintings will not suffice, but a wider acquaintance with works of every period of his artistic career is absolutely necessary. End of quote. The allusion to every period of a painter's career, and therefore to chronology, will be analyzed later. Let's first focus on the words, quote, a student of calligraphy will call them flourishes, Schnörkel, that were missing in the first version of Morelli's text, published in a Zeitschrift für Bildende Kunst. This parallel between the mechanical element in painting and handwriting was far from original. It had been pointed out in the 17th century by Giulio Mancini in his Considerazioni sulla pittura, text that had circulated in manuscript form and may have been read by Morelli. In any case, it seems unlikely that a connoisseur inspired by Georges Cuvier, like Morelli, might have ignored the remarkable writings of François-Xavier Burtin, born in 1743, he died in 1818. Besides some works on paleontology, which Cuvier had certainly read, Burtin wrote a traité théorique et pratique des connaissances qui sont nécessaires à tout amateur de tableau, 1808, which includes a passage like this. Next. The mechanical part especially becomes in painting, just as in writing, the most certain means of recognizing the author and the least liable to error. For although both may vary at pleasure the nature of their subjects, the one cannot in like manner alter his style, his orthography, and especially his handwriting, nor can the other change his coloring, his impasto, and his touch, and especially his handwriting. We are back to Schnörkel, to flourishes. As I've shown elsewhere, Morelli's emphasis on this point ignited the imagination of the great paleographer Ludwig Tauber. But on the importance of Schnörkel, Morelli was far from consistent. In the introduction to his book on the Borghese and Doria Pamphili galleries, he made fun of his German opponents who, next, have sought to make this method for the decisive identification of the author of a picture appear ridiculous by proclaiming that I am insensible to every deeper quality in a work of art and only regard its external features, laying particular stress upon the form of the hand, the ear, and even, horribile dictu, of the fingernails. But then a qualification followed. The mannerisms, Schnörkel, of those artists, of some artists, are simply the result of chance or habit. The typical or fundamental form, Grundform, of hand and ear is characteristic in the works of all independent masters and affords valuable evidence for identifying them, while mannerisms, Schnörkel, may at most serve to distinguish those of painters wanting in individuality. End of quote. Grundform on the one hand, Schnörkel on the other. This distinction, based on quality, was tacitly quoted by Berenson in his Rudiments of Connoisseurship, in a passage which has been interpreted wrongly as a distanciation from Morelli's method. But here a question inevitably arises. Should we argue that, according to Morelli, the hands and ears which allowed to recognize the works of Botticelli, Bramantino, Filippo Lippi, and so forth, far from being related to a mechanical habit, were the result of a conscious effort? The diagrams of hands and ears associated to the works of different painters were introduced by the following sentence. Next. Quote, for every important painter has, so to speak, a type of hand and ear peculiar to himself. End of quote. Nothing new for those who are familiar with Morelli's works, also because the related footnote emphasized once again the element of unconscious habit. Quote, I must here reiterate that the typical form, Grundform, of hand and ear peculiar to each of the great masters is not only to be found in all their pictures, but even in the portraits they painted from life. End of quote. In other words, the great masters' involuntary habits, missed by copyists, were stronger than their deliberate efforts to depict nature. But the next passage, a comparison between Raphael's different hands, strikes a different, in fact, opposite note. In a series of paintings from about 1504 to 1505, next, the metacarpus is broad and flat, the fingers somewhat lifeless, and the whole hand has a homely and commonplace character. After 1509, when Raphael came into contact with a higher class of society in Rome, his treatment of the hand became more refined, as in his cartoon for the School of Athens in the Ambrosiana in Milan. Till gradually he attained to the elegant, aristocratic form seen in the Madonna di Casa d'Alba, the Madonna della Seggiola, di Galatea, and so forth. To sum up, Raphael's involvement with higher society would have affected his way of depicting hands. In his Rudiments of Connoisseurship, Berenson made fun of this absurd argument without mentioning its author. Next. I'm not aware that among the Italians of the Renaissance there was such a thing as fashion in hands. Indeed, I doubt whether they would have understood in this connection the words aristocratic and plebeian, which came about, I fancy, through the fact that Van Dyck gave a certain form of hand to his seekers. Behind this bizarre passage, one can read an involuntary caricature of the tension between a static and a dynamic morphology, which was part of Georges Cuvier's intellectual legacy. Morelli approached this issue most often indirectly, whenever he suggested a date for a painting. But on one occasion, confronted with the attribution to Correggio of a painting owned by Lord Ashburton, now at the Metropolitan Museum, next. Next, please. Okay, this is the painting, which is now at the Metropolitan, and then we may come back to the previous next slide, please. And Morelli made some general remarks. As a quote, as a rule, indeed, writers on art are wont to form their opinion of a painter's mode of expression and of his character from his later work. Yet, in both Correggio's early works, the St. Francis in Dresden and Lord Ashburton's picture, you already find indications of those qualities which partly attract and partly repel us in his later pictures. The same faults, the same feeling in the treatment of the hands, and the same type of ear and the arrangement of drapery are apparent in them. Only the coloring is different in his early works, both in tone and in harmony, and recall Costa and the school. Next one, so next. So this is the painting who was owned by Lord Ashburton, and then the St. Francis next, St. Francis in Dresden. As is well known, Morelli was fond of including in his work long fictitious dialogues. We can imagine entering this slippery path by asking him, Signor Lermolier, how would you explain this persistent continuity in the case of Correggio and so many other painters? Should we ascribe it to an involuntary habit or to a conscious choice? I wonder how Morelli would have answered this question. Perhaps he would have answered to both. But that fictitious question is addressed, first of all, to myself. Since I'm not an art historian, I will translate it in general terms, relying upon a definition which I advanced at the end of a piece entitled The Bond of Shame, of what an individual is. Next. To speak of every human being having two bodies, the physical and the social, the visible and the invisible, is insufficient. It is more helpful to consider the individual as the point of convergence of multiple sets. We simultaneously belong to a species, Homo sapiens, a sex, a linguistic community, a political community, a professional community, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, we come across a set defined by 10 fingerprints, which has just one member, ourselves. To define an individual on the basis of his or her fingerprints certainly makes sense in some contexts, but an individual cannot be identified with his or her unique features. To achieve a fuller understanding of an individual's deeds and thoughts, present or past, we have to explore the interaction among these sets, specific and generic, to which he or she belongs. End of quote. All this may be translated into art historical terms. The equivalent of fingerprints would be Morellian traits, nails, ears, drapery. The equivalent of a linguistic community would be an artistic environment, and so on. Let's now go back to Piero's flagellation. Next, please. Sorry. This is the first slide. I don't know whether it's possible to go back to the first slide, but if it's too complicated, I go on. And to Morelli's reaction to it. Sublime as always in his dealing with perspective, but minute as a German. Other Italian painters at that time reacted to Flemish art, but Piero's version was certainly unique. A full analysis of Piero's trajectory would imply an interaction between specific and generic elements, between a static and a diachronic perspective. This brings us back to chronology and its implications. In the second edition of his book on Piero della Francesca, 1969, Kenneth Clark included a footnote, which was absent in the first edition. He, Piero, must also have seen the recent works of Andrea del Castagno, The Last Supper and Resurrection in Santa Polonia, the two chapels in the Servi, and the decorative wall paintings of famous men and women at Legnaia. Piero evidently had Castagno's resurrection in mind when he painted his masterpiece at Borgo San Sepolcro. The relationship between the two resurrections Andrea del Castagno's and Piero's. Next. No, sorry, there must be two images. Go on, please. Next. Okay, this is a, okay. Okay, let's go back to the previous one. Okay, this is Andrea del Castagno's Resurrection. It's a fresco, heavily damaged, as you can see, which can be seen in the Chiostro of Santa Polonia in Florence. And Kenneth Clark was saying, Piero evidently had Castagno's Resurrection, this one, in mind, when he painted his masterpiece at Borgo San Sepolcro. Next one, please. The relationship between the two resurrections, Andrea del Castagno's and Piero's, is obviously very close, but its implications are not self-evident. Strangely enough, Longhi did not comment on this issue, although he remarked that Andrea's frescoes in the cloister of Santa Polonia and other works by him, please go back to the, not in previous, but okay. He remarked that Andrea's frescoes in the cloister of Santa Polonia and other works by him cannot constitute, as it has usually been suggested, a precedent. They are, instead, a consequence of the work of Piero, who, besides being a far greater genius than the Florentine, meaning Andrea del Castagno, was by that time already accomplished in his art. End of quote. In a dense contribution published in 1966, Frederick Hart objected to this conclusion, suggesting, on the basis of a large amount of evidence, a chronological sequence which turned the relationship of the two painters in the opposite direction. Andrea del Castagno executed the frescoes in the Santa Polonia cloister in 1447. Piero presumably saw them in that year, because since then, it was impossible to visit the cloister. The profound, long-term impact of Andrea del Castagno's frescoes on Piero is beyond doubt. The Borgo San Sepolcro's resurrection cannot be dated with certainty, but it was undoubtedly executed after 1447. Its iconography is traditional. Next one, please. Okay, you may look at Andrea del Castagno iconography, and then next one, Piero. Its iconography is traditional, but the resemblance with Andrea del Castagno's fresco is so detailed that it was obviously based on an unmediated perception, which paved the way to an extraordinary reworking. The solemn frontal posture of Piero's resurrected Christ in Borgo San Sepolcro, as well as the translation of Andrea del Castagno's sculptural language into Piero's light, impregnated with color. But if I'm not mistaken, Clark's footnote and Hart's essay have been ignored by the recent literature, which refrained from analyzing the relationship between Piero and Andrea del Castagno and his resurrection. Chronology launched a challenge which has not been taken up yet. Thank you.
Carlo, thank you so much. I mean, that was a great talk. And, you know, of course, what the wonderful thing both about the Piero book and the both about the Piero, let me just get something out of the way here. The wonderful thing both about the Piero book and today's talk is, of course, as you well know, that everybody regards you as a master of close reading of text. I don't think anyone can doubt that. But this, of course, gives us an opportunity to see whether you are a close reader of visual images as well. You know, I refrain from even calling them visual text because I insist that we have to maintain the autonomy of seeing and words. But,
okay.
So, but unfortunately, you know, what I would like to hear is, it's very interesting that you should, you ended with a marvelous flourish. I think everybody, I have other questions for you, but this flourish of the resuscitating the comparison between Andrea del Castagno and Piero della Francesca and Piero della Francesca in their two resurrections is a fantastic exercise in connoisseurship, and in the best form of connoisseurship, because I think, I'll come back to this in a moment, the matter of dynamic versus static morphology is to some extent already resolved in your talk, but there's more than that, obviously, in this comparison between Castagno and Piero della Francesca. So I want you to clarify your position. I mean, did you leave it as an open question? Do we really want to take the Hart? I am inclined to take the line of Frederick Hart. Can you reiterate? I gather you took an anti-Frederick Hart line, that he cannot have seen the Andrea del Castagno.
Well, okay. I think that the resemblance from, I mean, from the iconographic point of view between the two frescoes is undeniable.
Yes.
I'm really shocked by the fact that Roberto Longo avoided, as far as I know, to address the issue. He simply said, on a general level, that since Piero was such a greater painting, it would have been impossible to assume that Andrea del Castagno had an impact on Piero's trajectory. Now, this is absurd, I would say. It stresses once again the importance of chronology, which, I mean, obviously should be included in a larger perspective, but we cannot ignore it. Now, first of all, there is a question: why was Longhi so blind vis-a-vis Andrea del Castagno? Actually, I found later a remark in a footnote of an essay saying that Longhi used to call him Castagnaccio, kind of a pun, a joke.
Yes.
But which implied, let's say, because Castagnaccio, as you know, is a kind of food, and but there is a derogatory meaning in Castagnaccio. So, I mean, Longhi, I think, had a scornful attitude vis-a-vis Andrea del Castagno because, I mean, his sculptural quality was something which was incompatible with Piero's trajectory, with Longhi's trajectory, which I analyzed in one of the appendixes of my book, in which you have, let's say, Piero, Bellini, Velasquez, Vermeer, up to the Impressionists, up to Cézanne. After all, I mean, Longhi made a comparison between Cézanne's landscape of Gardanne and a detail of Piero's frescoes in Arezzo. A shocking comparison. Obviously, he was not saying that there was a direct vision by Cézanne of Arezzo frescoes. As far as I know, Cézanne never went to Arezzo, but there was a kind of morphological resemblance which was related to a historical trajectory. Now, in the case of Andrea del Castagno and Piero, there is something which is completely different, meaning the fact that the two were close. In fact, Domenico Veneziano was the master of Piero. Castagno was close to Domenico Veneziano. So they were working at the same time in Florence, but Andrea del Castagno's resurrection was finished in 1447. And apparently after that date, Piero would have been unable to see the painting. So we should imagine, let's say, a long-term impact, possibly Piero making a drawing which he was able to reuse after probably 10 years. And let's say, besides this, there is, let's say, the impact of Andrea del Castagno at a stage of Piero's trajectory, which was a rather early one. So, I mean, I think that starting from this, again, I'm not an art historian, but I think that, let's say, the trajectory of, of Piero as a painter should be thought again, taking into account Andrea del Castagno.
So we agree with that. There are some questions we agree about that. There are some questions I'm going to get. I have 3 questions before me. I'm going to review them in a minute, but I don't want to let you go because I want to say before we get on to these questions, in a way, the most valuable part of today's presentation is making us rethink the bases of connoisseurship. You have already made us rethink the chronology of Piero's works. So we can discuss that until the cows come home. But I want to emphasize to the audience how important this discussion of yours has been, also how interesting your account of the etiology, as it were, of the ideas of Bernard Berenson on connoisseurship. Morelli has been known, but you have introduced a number of other figures, beginning with Charles Leblanc. Now, I just want to say something about Charles Leblanc in relation to this discussion, and then we'll get to this question. So I am listening to you, as I'm sure everybody else is, and we are seeing at least the logic, if we can call it that, behind the Morellian position, that we look at the unchanging mechanical aspects of individuals' particular traits. In other words, we are looking really at Grundformen rather than, as this wonderful word, Schnörkel. And you put forward the case for taking account of Schnörkel, but I think we are all in the end convinced by the Morellian approach, which is actually very interesting from the point of view of the epistemology of most of the, shall we say, the hard sciences, where we look for Grundformen, not inflected by, as Ginzburg himself would say, not inflected by anecdote. As we know, anecdote is also quite important to the analysis of things. But I think what the problems emerge precisely beginning with Charles Leblanc, whom we are inclined to dismiss as being sentimental. Qui peut faire l'âme d'une peintre? How can we know what the soul is? It seems too metaphysical, too vague. But my concern, I realize what is so brilliant about your talk, and I think that it's demonstrated in your talk, is that when you see Piero della Francesca and you see Castagno, and you are forced to make this comparison in the interest of establishing a chronology, you fall back on the objection of l'âme, of the soul, because it is inconceivable, at least to me and probably to most people who look, that Piero can have been thinking, he may have known the Castagno, but somehow he cannot have been thinking of the Castagno because the formal soul of the picture is in fact so diverse. The geometric forms, I mean, you talk about static, the static forms, to use this literally, of the Piero are totally different from the dynamic forms, as opposed to morphology, of the Castagno. But let me read, but you have really made us reflect very hard on this really interesting question, which has implications for the sciences as well. Go on.
Okay, first of all, I think that the distinction between Grundform and Schnörkel is a bit defensive. In other words, because a Schnörkel was certainly mechanical. So I think that Morelli's drive towards identifying mechanical clues focused on Schnörkel. Now, when the issue of quality was mentioned, he took this defensive attitude, opposing Grundformen and Schnörkel. But I think that, let's say, the interaction between mechanical elements and non-mechanical elements is something which is part of, let's say, the activity of a painter. Now, let's go back for a moment to Andrea del Castagno and Piero. I think that we may make a distinction between, let's say, iconography and, let's say, everything else. So in terms of iconography, certainly Piero was inspired by Andrea del Castagno, not only, let's say, the presence of the two soldiers and so on, but also the arrangement of the
Yes.
figures. But then he made, I would say, a translation, which for me it's a word full of implications. So, for instance, the change from, let's say, the contrapposto in Andrea del Castagno and the static frontal attitude of Christ in Piero's fresco, it's an act of interpretation. After all, I mean, interpres is the translator. And then there is the extraordinary translation of Andrea del Castagno's sculptural quality into that extraordinary, intricate relationship between the light and color, which is so striking in Piero's both frescoes and panels. So, I mean, we can see how Longhi was reacted to the latter, and let's say despising the former, and so missing the connection between the two painters.
So you have now introduced, we of course could have a discussion forever, so I'm going to restrain myself. But you've introduced the term translation, which is really interesting and not very often used in connoisseurship. And listening to you discuss paintings reminds me of Ernst Gombrich, whom we both admire, who once in a seminar about the inscription above the Duracell portrait, which I remember very well, in London in the late 1970s, he said, well, of course, I am not an art historian either, because it was a philologist who was doing this. So you are doing this again, Carlo, today, and you showed your art historical skills today, I would say, especially in this last analysis, even better than your chronological skills. So we have to discuss, you are coming to the next seminar. Here is a good question, which one anonymous attendee sent. Morelli's injunctions to against material Morelli's injunctions about material trifles in a master's paintings is a challenge for critical pattern identification, one which seems even more pertinent today with the digital humanities and with regard to the digital humanities and its penchant for algorithmic pattern recognition. This leaves one to speculate how a critic like Morelli might have responded to these recent computational developments. Would he have approved?
Well, I think I would say no. And why? Because, I mean, maybe I have a kind of negative bias towards digital humanities. I'm quite incompetent, but my impression is that anomalies tend to be marginalized in this kind of approach. And anomalies are obviously at the very center of Morelli's approach. And then there is the issue of reproduction. Now, what you lose in a reproduction is, let's say, a lot of things. Let's say size, texture, impasto, as Bjortan was saying, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we have, let's say, a extremely helpful, but also impoverished image of the original. And I think that, let's say, there is a real danger, historical danger, a historical threat about the loss of the originals. Here, I mean, there is another issue which I quickly will mention, meaning the relationship between texts and images. Because many years ago, I argued, I was not the first person to say this, but I argued that in our culture, there is a notion of an invisible text, which can be reproduced, disregarding, let's say, the color of the paper, etc. That was a long time before, let's say, the spread of internet. But we can imagine something like this, let's say, invading the field of art history, and there will be an enormous loss. So I think that, let's say, keeping the materiality of the originals is something which is a kind of historical task for art historians.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Carlo. I mean, that's an eloquent answer. I'm inclined to agree with you, partly because it's not clear to me that algorithmic pattern recognition actually has enough space for defining precisely things like the texture of a surface on the screen, the very minute details, because algorithm is always eliminating some, not only of the textual details, but some of the formal details as well. I think, you know, if you go and have a look at an ear by Raphael and ear by Lo Spagna, let us say, or Francesco Francia, you see very clearly the kinds of distinctions which Morelli was seeking. I'm a great believer in the Morellian method, and which I think would be completely escaped by any scanning of these objects. It would simply be overlooked, so to speak. It would be overlooked as if the way that the human eye would not. But this is really an important question in our time, and it makes further the case for the humanist dimension of what the humanities have to offer, the scientific analysis of things. So thank you for that. I want to correct another attendee, because it seems to me very important. There was a question here, which maybe you could correct it, but the correction is obvious. What about the role of patrons who commissioned paintings? They often determined almost all of the content and details.
Well, I would say that patrons were not interested in, let's say, earlobes. So they simply didn't care, you know. So, and I think, but this is an interesting question. In other words, Morelli was, let's say, focusing on something which was ignored by patrons, and it was not included in the relationship between patrons and painters. What does it mean? Obviously, I mean, we are talking about experiments in a scientific perspective. Now, in an experiment, less is more. So we have to ignore a lot of elements in order to focus on something which becomes the center of a scientific approach. Now, another approach would focus on patrons. Why not? Of course, that's very important. And then there would be the possibly conflictual relationship between the results of one approach and the results of another approach, which is something which I evoked when I mentioned Longhi's reaction to the iconography of the local iconography of the flagellation, and his bizarre acceptance of that iconography from a stylistic point of view. So let's say the interaction, which is often conflictual between different approaches, seems to me not only central in art history, but central in our relationship to reality, if I may say so.
Well, you may, of course you may. I mean, I think this is an amazingly illuminating answer to a rather simple question, which I think just demands the answer that in connoisseurship, the details are slightly beyond, Morellian goes slightly beyond the capacity of the patron. But let me just conclude, because I think we're being rushed to conclude. You began with this statement of Berenson's about how the Morellian approach somehow is subverted, not falsified by, not adequately falsified by the question of old age style, as it was said, that these individual details somehow will change at the end of a painter's, or in the course of a painter's life, as she or he grows older. But I am inclined to think that the Morellian details, properly perceived, will not change as much as Berenson suspected. In other words, that the true Morellian connoisseur will be able to detect the distinctive handling of painters over the course of a life. And in some ways, I wish I see that Vittorio Gallese has here been in the audience. And I think this is one area in which we might be able to make use of responses to movements made by painters, or the movements made by painters in the course of their lives, which do not change even across accidents. I mean, obviously, outwardly, they will change across accidents to one's ability to move and so on and so forth. But I think in the normal course of events, we ought to be able to show the continuing mechanicity of individual mechanicity of the applications of the brush to the painting surface, or the chisel to the sculpture.
Maybe, but I think there is a test which should be looked at very closely, meaning Titian. Now, I mean, if we would have, let's say, Titian's early paintings and Titian's last paintings and nothing in between, well, this would be a real test for the connoisseur. And I don't know whether, I mean, the use of a Morellian approach would give a positive result. I'm not sure, but I think this is the first test I can think about for this kind of a question, which is relevant. Certainly
Okay.
Very relevant.
I see exactly why you adduced Titian. The art historians will understand exactly. I suspect most, but not all of them will agree with you. But this is a question which we leave until our next encounter. It's a wonderful puzzle with which to resolve it. We will both think of possible answers. And once more, Carlo, I thank you for the most illuminating discussion and most illuminating presentation today, a marvelous exemplification of a number of aspects of your contributions to the question of proof. In the end, this is a question of how we deal with different kinds of evidence and how we in the humanities proceed to arrive at a form of proof. So, you know, you are moving next week's lecture. You will be talking about not totally unrelated matters, about Walter Benjamin and his views of reproduction, which, you know, I was going to say, we still don't know enough about, yes.
I think my presentation will be more oblique, but we will see.
We will see. But, you know, let me just say, you've given us these great lectures that have focused around individual names in the history of culture, but of course have broadened widely to the implications of their production. And I'm sure this is going to be the case with Walter Benjamin. And I like to think of Walter Benjamin in the same way I think about Piero, at least in one respect. They are extraordinary outliers in terms of the inventiveness possible to people within their own culture. They are outliers, they are individuals, they are not Castagno even, they are Piero della Francesca. He is not anybody in German culture, not Schopenhauer, he is Walter Benjamin, he is certainly not the Wiener Kreis. So we look forward to your presentation next week, Carlo. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo, on behalf of all of us at the Academy. Thank you.
Thank you.